Everything changed the night Marcus found the silver cube in the archive basement, when the lights flickered 3 times, and the air itself seemed to hum with a frequency older than prayer. He was nobody special, just a maintenance worker at a small diocesan library in rural Montana, a man who fixed broken shelves and swept floors beneath crucifixes, a man who had taken the job after his carpentry business failed and his wife left with their daughter for a life that didn't smell like sawdust and disappointment. Marcus had grown up on a cattle ranch outside of Billings, learned to work with his hands before he learned to read, and carried in his chest the quiet faith of people who watch sunrise over endless fields and know without being told that something greater moves through the world. He had never imagined that his life would intersect with mysteries beyond the Montana sky, never thought that a letter from Rome would arrive at the bishop's office requesting someone trustworthy, someone ordinary, someone whose hands knew labor and whose heart still remembered how to be still. The letter came on a Tuesday in October, when the aspens were turning gold and the first snow was threatening the high country. Bishop Carroll called Marcus into his office, a wood-paneled room that smelled of leather and old books, and explained that the Vatican was conducting a routine inventory of items distributed to various dioceses over the centuries, items that had been forgotten in the chaos of wars and reforms and the slow drift of time. Some artifacts needed to be photographed and catalogued. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required expertise, just a careful eye and a willingness to document what had been hidden in storage rooms and forgotten chapels across rural America. The bishop said they chose Marcus because he was methodical, because he showed up every day without complaint, because there was something in his personnel file about a background in woodworking and restoration, though Marcus could barely remember filling out those forms 3 years ago, when he needed the job more than he needed dignity. The bishop handed him a thick envelope containing travel instructions, a modest stipend, and a list of 7 locations across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, where he would spend the next 6 weeks examining boxes that hadn't been opened since before the Second World War. Marcus took the envelope and nodded, not because he understood why they chose him, but because he had learned long ago that sometimes you say yes to things that don't make sense, and sometimes those things save you from the noise in your own head. The first 3 locations yielded nothing remarkable, just chalices tarnished green with age, vestments eaten by moths, ledgers recording births and deaths in parishes that no longer existed. Marcus photographed everything according to the instructions, measured dimensions, noted any markings or inscriptions, and filed his reports through a secure portal that seemed absurdly sophisticated for documenting old church relics. He slept in roadside motels that all looked the same, ate at diners where waitresses called him honey, and refilled his coffee without asking, and drove through landscapes so empty that he sometimes went hours without seeing another vehicle. There was something peaceful about the work, something that quieted the restlessness that had followed him since the divorce, and he found himself talking to God again in those long stretches of highway, not praying exactly, but acknowledging the presence of something vast and patient that seemed to travel beside him in the passenger seat, where his daughter used to sit. The 4th location was different. It was a closed monastery in the Black Hills of South Dakota, a stone building that had housed Benedictine monks until the 1950s, when the last 3 brothers died within a year of each other, and the order decided the place was too remote to maintain. The building had been locked and forgotten, its ownership transferred to the Diocese of Rapid City, which had neither the resources nor the interest to do anything with it. Marcus arrived on a gray afternoon, when clouds hung low over the ponderosa pines, and the air tasted like coming rain. The key the bishop gave him was old iron, heavy in his palm, and it took him several minutes to work it into the rusted lock. The door opened with a sound like something breathing, and Marcus stepped into darkness that smelled of stone and silence, and something else, something he couldn't name, but that made the hair on his arm stand up in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He set up his equipment in what had been the monastery's library, a vaulted room where light fell through narrow windows in shafts thick with dust. The boxes were stacked against the far wall, marked with numbers and dates in faded ink, and Marcus began the familiar process of opening, examining, photographing, documenting. He worked through the afternoon as the light changed and the shadows grew longer, finding the usual items, the expected relics, nothing that warranted more than routine notation. But in the last box, beneath layers of cloth that might have once been white, he found something that stopped his hands mid-motion and made his breath catch in his throat. It was a cube, perhaps 6 inches on each side, made of a metal that looked like silver but seemed to shift in the light. Its surface covered in markings that were definitely not Latin, not Greek, not any language Marcus had ever seen. The markings seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, seemed to rearrange themselves into patterns that almost made sense before dissolving back into chaos. He lifted the cube carefully, surprised by its weight, and felt a vibration pass through his hands and up his arms, a sensation like touching a tuning fork that was resonating at a frequency just below hearing. Marcus set the cube on the table and reached for his camera, but when he looked through the viewfinder, the markings on the cube's surface weren't visible. He lowered the camera and looked directly at the object, and there they were, clear and intricate and impossible. He tried again, same result, the photograph showing only blank silver surfaces that reflected his confused face back at him. He sat down heavily in a chair that creaked under his weight and stared at the thing he had found, this object that seemed to exist in a space between what could be documented and what could only be experienced. His instructions said to photograph everything, but how do you photograph something that refuses to be captured? How do you document a thing that seems to flicker between states of existence, like a light bulb with faulty wiring? The rain started then, drumming on the roof with a sound like fingers on a tabla drum, and Marcus realized he had been sitting in near darkness for longer than he intended. He stood to find a light switch, and the moment his fingers touched the wall, every light in the building came on simultaneously, bright and harsh and wrong, because Marcus knew with absolute certainty that there was no electricity in this abandoned monastery, no power lines running to this forgotten place in the hills. The lights burned with an intensity that hurt his eyes, and the cube on the table began to hum, a sound that he felt in his teeth and his chest and the base of his skull. He stepped backward, knocking over his chair, and the lights flickered once, twice, 3 times, and in the darkness between flickers he saw something standing in the corner of the room, a shape that was tall and still, and watching him with attention that felt like pressure against his skin. When the light steadied, the corner was empty, but Marcus knew what he had seen, knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name, knew that something had been there and might still be there, invisible in the spectrum of light his eyes could process. He grabbed the cube without thinking, shoved it into his backpack along with his camera and notes, and walked quickly toward the door, trying not to run, trying to maintain some dignity in his retreat. But the door wouldn't open, the handle turning freely in his hand, but the door itself refusing to budge, as if the building had decided he wasn't allowed to leave. Not yet, not until something was finished. Marcus put his back against the door and faced the room, his heart hammering in his chest, and said aloud into the silence, "What do you want?" His voice sounded small and foolish, the voice of a man talking to shadows, but the question hung in the air like smoke, and something answered, not with words, but with a sensation that flooded through him like water through a broken dam. The sensation was not unpleasant, though it was overwhelming, a feeling of being known completely, seen through to every thought and memory and secret shame, and instead of horror, there was only a strange relief, as if he had been waiting his whole life for someone to finally look at him and understand. Images filled his mind, not his own memories, but something else, something vast and old and utterly foreign. He saw stars that weren't stars, geometries that made his eyes water, cities built of light and sound and mathematics he had no language to describe. He saw beings moving through spaces that had too many dimensions, their forms shifting and flowing like water, like fire, like thoughts given shape. And he saw Earth, small and blue and precious, watched over by presences that had been there since before humans learned to make fire, presences that moved between planets like children moving between rooms in a house, presences that were neither angels nor demons, but something else entirely, something the old words couldn't capture because the old words were made for a smaller universe. And then he saw the Vatican, not as it is now but as it was centuries ago, saw robed figures moving through corridors deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, carrying objects wrapped in cloth, objects that hummed and glowed and sang in frequencies that shattered glass. He saw a pope whose name he didn't know kneeling before one of the beings, not in worship, but in conversation, in negotiation, in the sharing of knowledge that would be written down and locked away and forgotten by everyone, except those who kept the deepest secrets. He saw the objects being distributed, sent to monasteries and missions and small churches in distant lands, hidden in plain sight among the relics and reliquaries, waiting for a time when they would be needed, waiting for the right hands to find them, waiting for the transformation that was coming whether humanity was ready or not. The vision released him, and Marcus collapsed to his knees on the stone floor, gasping like he had been underwater, tears streaming down his face for reasons he couldn't articulate. The door behind him swung open, revealing the rainy darkness outside, and he understood that he was free to leave now, that the building had given him what he needed and was releasing him back into the ordinary world. But Marcus didn't move, couldn't move because something fundamental had shifted inside him, some barrier had dissolved, and he knew with a clarity that felt like pain that his life would never be simple again, that he had been chosen not for his expertise, but for his ordinariness, for his ability to be broken open and remade without shattering completely. He drove through the rain to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and sat on the bed with the cube resting on the nightstand beside him. The humming had stopped, or perhaps he had learned to tune it out, and in the yellow light of the bedside lamp, it looked like nothing more than an unusual paperweight, a curiosity that might sit on a desk in some collector's office. But Marcus knew better now, knew that appearances were the least reliable way to understand what was real, knew that the universe was full of things that hid in plain sight because human perception was too narrow to contain them. He opened his laptop and began to type a report, but the words that appeared on the screen weren't the ones he intended to write. Instead of measurements and descriptions, he found himself writing about the vision, about the beings, about the Vatican's secret history of contact with intelligences that had been watching humanity since before the pyramids were built. He wrote for hours, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a sureness he didn't feel, and when he finally stopped and read what he had written, he knew it was true, knew it with a certainty that bypassed logic and landed directly in his bones. He slept poorly, plagued by dreams that weren't quite dreams, visions of light and sound and presence that left him exhausted when he woke. The cube sat on the nightstand, innocent and silent, but Marcus could feel it there, could sense its attention like a weight on his chest. He showered and dressed, and sat in the motel's breakfast room drinking terrible coffee and eating rubbery eggs, watching the other guests, truck drivers and traveling salesmen, and a family with 2 small children who were fighting over a tablet. They all looked so normal, so completely unaware that the world they thought they knew was a thin skin over something vast and strange, and Marcus felt a distance open between himself and them, a gap that he didn't know how to cross. He paid his bill and loaded his truck and continued to the next location on his list, a small church in eastern Wyoming, but his heart wasn't in the work anymore. His mind kept returning to the monastery and the vision and the question that wouldn't leave him alone. Why him? Why now? Why had he been chosen to carry this impossible knowledge? The Wyoming church yielded another cube, this one smaller and darker, hidden inside a tabernacle that hadn't been opened in decades. Marcus found it without surprise, as if some part of him had known it would be there, as if the first cube was calling to its companion across the distance. He placed the second cube in his backpack next to the first, and felt the hum intensify, the 2 objects resonating with each other like notes in a chord. That night, in another anonymous motel room, the beings came to him, not in vision, but in presence, manifesting in a way that his senses could barely process. They were tall and luminous and utterly calm, their forms suggesting bodies but never quite resolving into solid matter, their faces, if they had faces, obscured by light that seemed to originate from within. They didn't speak, but Marcus understood them anyway, understood that they had been waiting for someone like him, someone broken enough to be open, someone ordinary enough to be trusted with extraordinary things. They showed him more, filling his mind with information that felt like liquid fire, burning away his assumptions about reality and replacing them with something larger and more terrifying and more beautiful than anything he had imagined. They showed him that the story of Jesus was true, but not in the way the churches taught it, not as a singular miraculous intervention, but as part of a pattern that repeated across worlds and ages, beings of light incarnating into matter to teach and guide and prepare populations for the transformation that came when a species reached a certain threshold of consciousness. They showed him that the cross was a symbol older than Christianity, a representation of the intersection between dimensions, the point where the vertical axis of spirit meets the horizontal plane of matter, and that every religion had glimpsed pieces of this truth and wrapped it in the language and metaphors available to them. They showed him that the return, the second coming, the rapture, all the prophecies that humans had been waiting for with fear and hope were not about judgment, but about awakening, about the moment when the veils between worlds would thin and humanity would have to choose whether to step forward into a larger reality or retreat into the comfort of ignorance. Marcus wept as the information poured through him, not from sadness but from the sheer overwhelming magnitude of what he was being shown, the terrible beauty of a universe that was alive and conscious and intimately involved in the evolution of every creature within it. The beings touched him then, not physically but in some other way, and he felt something shift inside his chest, felt a door open that he hadn't known was closed, felt light flood into spaces in his soul that had been dark since childhood. When they withdrew, leaving him alone in the motel room with the two cubes humming softly on the dresser, he understood that he had been changed at a cellular level, that he was no longer entirely the man who had driven into the Black Hills with a list of locations and a camera, that he was becoming something else, something that existed in the space between human and whatever came next. He continued his journey, finding cubes in each of the remaining locations, 7 in total, 7 silver objects that sang to each other in harmonies that made reality shimmer at the edges. With each discovery, the beings came to him, teaching him, showing him, preparing him for something he couldn't yet name. And with each encounter, Marcus felt his old life falling away like dead skin, felt his attachment to his past dissolving, felt the questions that had tormented him about his failed marriage and lost business revealing themselves as distractions, as the noise that keeps humans from hearing the deeper music that vibrates beneath the surface of things. He stopped filing reports, stopped answering emails from the bishop's office, stopped maintaining the fiction that this was a routine inventory of forgotten church property. The only thing that mattered was the cubes, the beings, the truth that was being revealed to him piece by piece, like a vast mosaic coming into focus. On the last night, in a motel room in North Dakota with all 7 cubes arranged on the bed in a pattern the beings had shown him, Marcus experienced something that shattered the last fragments of his ordinary consciousness. The cubes began to glow, softly at first and then brighter, filling the room with light that didn't behave like light, light that bent around corners and passed through walls, and seemed to exist in more dimensions than the 3 he was equipped to perceive. The beings manifested fully, no longer flickering at the edge of visibility but present and solid and undeniable, and they spoke to him not with words, but with a transmission of pure meaning that bypassed language entirely. They told him that the Vatican had known about them for 2,000 years, had made contact shortly after the crucifixion, when the event created a ripple in reality that attracted attention from across the galaxy, had been given the cubes as gifts and warnings and tools to prepare humanity for what was coming. They told him that the prophecies were real, that the end times described in Revelation and Daniel and the secret texts locked in Vatican vaults were not metaphors, but descriptions of an actual transformation that occurred when a species evolved past a certain point, when the collective consciousness reached a frequency that allowed it to perceive and interact with the larger reality that most humans filtered out. They told him that some would make the transition and some would not, that the rapture was not about worthiness, but about readiness, about the willingness to let go of the small self and merge with something infinitely larger. They told him that Jesus had been one of them, a being of light who took human form to show humanity what was possible, to plant seeds that would germinate over centuries, to prepare the ground for the harvest that was approaching. And they told him that he had been chosen to carry this message, not to preach or convince or convert, but simply to live it, to embody the transformation, to become a silent witness to the truth that could not be spoken, but only demonstrated through the quality of his presence. They told him that there were others like him, scattered across the world, ordinary people who had been touched and changed and sent back into their lives carrying light that would spread without effort, without noise, without the need for proof or validation. They told him that the time was close, that the signs were everywhere for those with eyes to see, that the world was already changing, and the changes would accelerate until the old structures collapsed and something new emerged from the ruins. When the transmission ended, Marcus found himself lying on the floor of the motel room, with dawn light streaming through the windows and the cubes gone, vanished as completely as if they had never existed. He sat up slowly, checking his body for injury, but he felt fine, better than fine, felt a vitality and clarity he hadn't experienced since he was a young man. He checked his backpack, his equipment, his notes, and found no evidence of the cubes, no photographs, no documentation, nothing that would prove what he had experienced. For a moment, doubt crept in, the rational part of his mind suggesting that he had suffered some kind of breakdown, that grief and loneliness had fractured his psyche and created an elaborate delusion. But then he looked at his hands and saw them glowing faintly, saw light moving beneath his skin like rivers of luminescence, and he knew with absolute certainty that what had happened was real, that he had been changed at a level that transcended belief or disbelief. Marcus drove home to Montana, to the small apartment above the hardware store where he had been living since the divorce. He didn't return to work at the diocesan library, didn't explain his absence, didn't try to make sense of his journey to anyone else. He simply resumed his life, but everything was different now, every moment infused with a presence that made ordinary tasks feel sacred. He found work as a handyman, fixing broken things for people who needed help, and discovered that his touch seemed to carry something beyond skill, that faucets he repaired stopped leaking permanently, that doors he hung never needed adjustment, that gardens he tended flourished with unusual abundance. People sought him out, not understanding why, drawn by something they couldn't name, and Marcus would work in silence, his presence alone seeming to calm their anxieties and quiet their restless minds. He started attending a small church on the edge of town, sitting in the back pew during Sunday services, saying nothing but radiating something that made other congregants turn and stare and wonder who he was. The pastor noticed him, tried to engage him in conversation, but Marcus had little to say, could only smile and nod, and offer a handshake that left the pastor feeling strangely moved, as if he had been blessed by someone with access to grace he could only theorize about. Marcus didn't speak about what he had experienced, didn't try to convince anyone of anything, but his life became a testament to transformation, his very existence a quiet proof that the walls between worlds were thinner than most people imagined. Months passed, then a year, and Marcus noticed changes in the world around him, signs that others might dismiss, but that he recognized as confirmations of what the beings had told him. More people reported seeing lights in the sky, strange phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional science. The news carried stories of mass awakenings, people spontaneously remembering past lives, experiencing visions of other realms, speaking in languages they had never learned. Religious leaders began talking about a new reformation, a transformation of consciousness that was sweeping through congregations and causing people to question the old dogmas and seek direct experience of the divine. Scientists published papers about quantum consciousness and the holographic nature of reality, ideas that would have been dismissed as pseudoscience just years before, but were now being debated in prestigious journals. And Marcus watched it all with a calm certainty, knowing that he was witnessing exactly what the beings had promised, the unfolding of a transformation that would ultimately reshape human civilization. He didn't feel special or chosen, didn't consider himself a prophet or a messenger, understood that he was simply one thread in a vast tapestry being woven by forces beyond comprehension. His old questions about meaning and purpose had dissolved, replaced by a simple presence, a way of being in the world that required nothing but attention and openness. He thought sometimes about his daughter, wondered if she would find him when she was ready, trusted that if the beings wanted them reunited, they would arrange it. He thought about his ex-wife, sent her forgiveness across the distance, hoped she had found whatever she was looking for. On a night in late autumn, exactly 2 years after he found the first cube in the Black Hills Monastery, Marcus stood outside his apartment, looking up at stars so bright they seemed to pulse with intention. The air was cold and still, and he could see his breath rising like smoke, like prayer, like the visible evidence of invisible life. He thought about how much had changed, how the man who had driven into those hills with a routine assignment no longer existed, had been dissolved and reformed into something that had no name in any language he knew. He thought about the Vatican and its secrets, about the centuries of contact and conspiracy and careful preparation, about the silver cubes that might still be hidden in forgotten corners, waiting for other hands to find them. He thought about Jesus and the cross and the promise of return, understanding now that it had never been about a man descending from clouds, but about consciousness, ascending to meet what had always been there, waiting patiently for humans to grow up enough to perceive it. A light moved across the sky, too slow for a meteor, too fast for a plane, and Marcus watched it with a smile, recognizing the familiar signature of presence, the beings checking in, reminding him that he was not alone, that he had never been alone, that the universe was crowded with intelligence and love and an attention so vast it could hold every suffering and joy simultaneously without strain. He raised his hand in greeting or farewell or acknowledgement, and the light pulsed once brighter, before disappearing beyond the horizon. Marcus turned and went inside, climbed the stairs to his small apartment, and lay down on his bed fully clothed, feeling sleep approach like a gentle hand. In the moment before consciousness dissolved, he understood that every ending was a beginning, that death itself was just another transition, another thinning of the veil, another doorway opening onto rooms he couldn't yet imagine, but that were already waiting, already prepared, already home. In the years that followed, people who met Marcus would sometimes comment on the quality of his attention, the way he seemed to be listening to something beyond the conversation, the way his presence made rooms feel larger and time move differently. Some thought he was simple, a man who had retreated from the complexity of modern life into some pastoral simplicity. Others sensed something deeper, something that made them uncomfortable, or curious, or strangely hopeful. Children were drawn to him, animals trusted him, plants flourished in his care. He never married again, never accumulated possessions beyond what fit in his small apartment, never sought recognition or tried to build a following. He simply lived day by day, moment by moment, carrying within him the secret knowledge that the world was on the edge of transformation, that the prophecies were unfolding exactly as foretold, that the return was not a single event, but a process already underway, visible to those who had learned to see with more than eyes. And on quiet nights when the stars were bright and the veil was thin, Marcus would sometimes feel the presence of the beings, their wordless communication flooding through him like music, reminding him that he was loved, that humanity was loved, that the universe itself was an expression of love so vast and patient that it could wait millennia for a single species to wake up and recognize itself as part of the cosmic family. He would stand at his window looking out at the sleeping town, at the ordinary houses full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, and he would know with a certainty that transcended faith that every one of them carried the same divine spark, the same potential for transformation, the same destiny of awakening. The only difference was timing, readiness, the mysterious grace that opened some hearts earlier than others. But ultimately everyone would make the journey, everyone would cross the threshold, everyone would discover that heaven was not a place to go, but a frequency to embody, a way of being that had always been available, but that fear had kept locked away. Continuation of Part 2. The sun set over Montana, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and the four who remained stood on the porch of Sarah's cabin and watched the day end and the night begin. And they felt the presence of Marcus and Sarah so close they could almost touch them, felt the beings all around, felt the whole vast community of consciousness that held them and guided them and loved them beyond measure. And they knew that when their own time came, they would step across that threshold without fear, would rejoin the community of light that had sent them into physical form for this specific mission, this sacred service, this extraordinary privilege of being alive during the greatest transformation humanity had ever experienced. David was the next to feel the call, the sense that his work in physical form was approaching completion. He had continued driving his routes across the Midwest, carrying freight and carrying light, stopping at truck stops and rest areas where other drivers would approach him without knowing why, drawn by something they couldn't name, and he would sit with them over coffee and say almost nothing, but his presence would crack something open in their chests, and they would drive away, changed, softened, aware of dimensions they had been filtering out their entire lives. He noticed that accidents decreased on the routes he traveled, that weather patterns seemed to shift to clear his path, that the truck itself required less maintenance than physics could explain, as if the beings were extending their protection to everything he touched. One night, parked at a rest stop in Iowa with snow falling silent and thick around his cab, David felt the beings manifest more fully than they ever had before, felt them fill the small space with presence so dense he could barely breathe, and they showed him what was about to happen, showed him that the transformation was reaching its critical threshold, that within months the veil would tear completely, and humanity would be faced with undeniable proof that they were not alone, had never been alone, that the universe was populated with consciousness in forms beyond imagining. They showed him ships appearing in skies over major cities, not attacking or demanding, but simply being there, visible and undeniable, forcing humanity to reckon with reality beyond their limited paradigms. They showed him governments scrambling to explain, religions fracturing as their exclusive claims to truth dissolved, scientists struggling to incorporate data that shattered their materialist assumptions. But they also showed him that the prepared ones, people like Marcus and Sarah, and the thousands of others who had been quietly transformed over the decades, would serve as calm centers in the storm, would be the ones others turned to when fear threatened to overwhelm, would be living proof that contact with non-human intelligence didn't have to be traumatic, that it could be beautiful, illuminating, transformative. They showed him that his death would serve as a beacon, that his transition would create a ripple in the collective consciousness that would help others release their fear of dying, would demonstrate that the threshold between worlds was not a wall, but a doorway, not an ending, but a continuation. David accepted this with the same quiet grace that had characterized his entire journey, understanding that service sometimes meant sacrifice, that his final act would be to die consciously and publicly, in a way that would help others understand that death was not the enemy they had been taught to fear. 3 weeks later, while driving through a blizzard in South Dakota, David's truck left the road and rolled down an embankment, and in the moments before impact, he felt no fear, only excitement about what came next, only gratitude for the extraordinary life he had been privileged to live. When emergency responders arrived and extracted his body from the wreckage, they reported that he was smiling, that his face held an expression of such peace and joy that it disturbed them more than any trauma they had witnessed, that several of them went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about the dead man who looked like he had just heard the best news of his life. The story of David's death spread through the network of truck drivers who had known him, and many reported dreams in which he appeared to them surrounded by light, telling them not to grieve, that he was more alive now than he had ever been, that the transformation was real and approaching fast, and they should prepare not with fear but with excitement. Some dismissed these dreams as grief-induced hallucinations, but others recognized them as genuine contact, as David reaching back across the veil to offer comfort and guidance, and these drivers found themselves changing, softening, opening to possibilities they had spent their lives denying. Elizabeth was working under a car in her garage in Rapid City when she felt David's transition, felt the moment his consciousness expanded beyond the limits of flesh, and she set down her tools and wept not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of what she had witnessed through their psychic connection, the joy and liberation of a soul returning home after a long journey in foreign lands. She closed the garage early that day and drove to the spot where David had died, stood in the snow looking at the skid marks and broken guardrail, and felt his presence so strongly that she actually turned around expecting to see him standing behind her. Instead, she saw light, pillars of light rising from the earth where his blood had soaked into the soil, visible only to her transformed perception, marking the place where a portal had opened, where the veil had torn slightly, where those sensitive enough could feel the proximity of other dimensions. Elizabeth began visiting the site regularly, and other people started appearing there too, people who had no conscious knowledge of what had happened but who felt drawn to the location, felt peace there, felt something they couldn't articulate, but that made them return again and again. Local authorities tried to remove the makeshift memorial that spontaneously appeared, flowers and candles, and notes from strangers who had never met David, but who felt compelled to honor something sacred that had occurred in that place. But every time they cleared the site, the memorial reappeared, until finally they gave up and let it be, not understanding that they were witnessing the early stages of a transformation that would soon engulf the entire planet. Margaret, on her farm in Wyoming, felt the acceleration too, noticed that her crops were growing with impossible speed and vigor, that the soil itself seemed to be glowing with light, that animals from miles around were gathering on her property as if seeking sanctuary. She understood that her farm had become a power spot, a place where the veil was particularly thin, where people could come and feel the presence of something greater, where healing happened spontaneously for those open to receive it. She stopped selling her produce through normal channels and instead began giving it away to anyone who asked, and word spread about the woman with the magical garden where vegetables tasted like they contained more than nutrition, where people who ate them reported vivid dreams and spontaneous healings and a sense of being connected to something vast and loving. Scientists tried to study Margaret's farm, brought equipment to measure soil composition and radiation levels and electromagnetic anomalies, but their instruments malfunctioned in her presence, readings fluctuating wildly, batteries draining instantly, cameras producing images that showed light in spectrums that shouldn't have been visible. Margaret allowed them to investigate, but offered no explanations, simply smiled and offered them vegetables and invited them to sit in her garden in silence, and some of them did. And those who did found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about reality, found their carefully constructed materialist worldviews crumbling under the weight of direct experience that transcended explanation. The three remaining members of the original group began gathering more frequently, sensing that their time together was limited, that soon they too would cross over and the work would pass to others, to the younger generation of awakened ones who were emerging with increasing frequency. They noticed that children especially seemed to be arriving already transformed, already aware of the multidimensional nature of reality, already in contact with the beings, speaking matter-of-factly about their star families and previous lives and the coming changes. Parents brought these children to Margaret's farm, desperate for someone who wouldn't think their kids were crazy or in need of medication, and Margaret would sit with the children and listen to their stories and confirm that yes, what they were experiencing was real, that they were not broken but gifted, not sick but sensitive, not delusional but aware. On a spring night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, the three of them sat around a fire pit at Margaret's farm and felt the presence of Marcus and Sarah and David join them, felt the boundary between the living and the dead dissolve completely, felt themselves existing simultaneously in physical form and in the realm of light, straddling worlds, serving as bridges. The beings manifested in the fire, their forms dancing in the flames, and they communicated through feeling rather than words, conveying that the time had come, that the ships would appear soon, that humanity's isolation was about to end permanently, that the prophecies were on the verge of fulfillment. They were shown that the disclosure would not happen through government announcement, but through direct experience, through ships appearing simultaneously over cities worldwide, through telepathic contact occurring spontaneously with millions of people, through undeniable proof that consciousness existed independent of biological form, that life populated the universe in abundance, that Earth had been carefully tended and guided by elder civilizations for millions of years. They were shown that some humans would welcome this revelation with joy and relief, while others would resist violently, that there would be a period of intense chaos and conflict as old power structures fought to maintain control even as their foundations dissolved. But they were also shown that the prepared ones, the network of transformed individuals scattered across the planet, would hold steady through the storm, would be ports in the tempest, would demonstrate through their calm presence that there was nothing to fear, that this was graduation, not invasion, celebration, not catastrophe, the fulfillment of every prophecy and promise that spiritual traditions had been pointing toward for thousands of years. They were shown that the Christ consciousness Jesus had embodied would flower in millions of hearts simultaneously, that the resurrection would be collective, not individual, that the kingdom of heaven would manifest on earth not through divine intervention, but through human evolution, through consciousness recognizing its own divine nature. Elizabeth was the next to transition, not through death but through transfiguration, her physical body becoming increasingly transparent, increasingly filled with light, until one morning she simply didn't wake up in the ordinary sense, but was found by a friend sitting in meditation posture, with her eyes open and her body radiating light so bright it was difficult to look at directly. Medical personnel who examined her found vital signs but barely, found brain activity but in patterns they had never seen, found a body that was technically alive, but functioning according to principles beyond their understanding. After 3 days in this state, Elizabeth's body dissolved completely, vanished without residue, leaving only light that faded slowly over several hours, and those who witnessed it understood they had seen the future, had seen what humans were becoming, had seen the resurrection made literal. Margaret felt Elizabeth's transfiguration as a call to her own, understood that she too was being invited to make the transition not through death, but through transformation, through conscious evolution of her physical form into something that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. She prepared carefully, giving away her possessions, writing letters to those she loved, arranging for her farm to become a sanctuary maintained by the community of awakened ones who had gathered around her. On the summer solstice, surrounded by hundreds who had come to witness, Margaret sat beneath an ancient cottonwood tree and began to glow, her body becoming increasingly transparent, increasingly luminous, and she spoke her final words in physical form. This is not goodbye but transformation, not ending but beginning, not death but birth, into the larger life that includes and transcends this one. I am not leaving you but expanding to include more of what I have always been. We are all invited. To this dance we are all capable of this flowering. Fear is the only barrier and love is the only requirement. And then Margaret dissolved into light, her body transforming into pure energy that rose like a pillar into the sky, and those watching felt her consciousness expand to include them all, felt themselves temporarily merged with her awareness, felt what she was experiencing, the unspeakable joy of release from physical limitations, the ecstatic reunion with the larger self that had sent a fragment into human form to perform a specific mission, the certainty that everything was unfolding, perfectly according to a plan so vast and intricate that human minds could only glimpse tiny portions of its magnificence. The pillar of light shot into the sky and became a star, visible for 3 nights before fading, and people who saw it from hundreds of miles away reported feeling blessed, changed, open to possibility they had spent their lives denying. Now only one remained of the original 5, and the burden of being the last one standing fell heavily on shoulders that had grown old and tired. But the community had expanded far beyond the original group, hundreds, now thousands of transformed individuals forming networks across North America and beyond, comparing notes, sharing experiences, preparing for what they all felt approaching like a wave about to break. The internet filled with testimonies, videos, documentation of phenomena that mainstream media could no longer ignore, and the narrative began to shift from whether contact with non-human intelligence was real to what it meant and how humanity should respond. Churches split between those who saw the beings as demonic deception and those who recognized them as the angels and messengers their scriptures had always described, between those who clung to literal interpretations of ancient texts and those who understood that all scripture pointed toward truths that transcended the specific cultural contexts in which they were written. Scientists divided between those who insisted the phenomena must have naturalistic explanations not yet discovered, and those who acknowledged that consciousness might be primary, that materialism might be an incomplete paradigm, that reality might be far stranger and more wonderful than their equations could capture. And then it happened. On a morning in October, exactly 25 years after Marcus found the first cube, ships appeared in the skies over every major city on Earth, massive and silent and undeniable, not threatening but simply present, forcing humanity to acknowledge what could no longer be denied. The last remaining member of the original 5 stood in a field, watching the ship hover over Billings, felt the presence of Marcus and Sarah and David and Elizabeth and Margaret standing beside her in spirit form, felt the beings inside the ship reaching out telepathically to everyone below who was open to receive, felt the transmission of love and welcome and invitation to step forward into a larger understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to be alive, what it meant to be conscious in a universe that was itself conscious and creative and infinitely more interesting than the prison of materialism had suggested. The transformation had begun in earnest now, no longer subtle or deniable but explicit and unavoidable, and humanity stood at the threshold Marcus and the others had been preparing for, the choice point between fear and love, between contraction and expansion, between clinging to the familiar or embracing the unknown, and everything that had been prophesied was coming true not as punishment but as invitation, not as ending but as beginning, not as the apocalypse but as the apotheosis, the revealing of what had always been true but that most had been too afraid or too distracted to acknowledge.